Well, welcome to the fourth video in this series called Seriously, where we're looking at the book by Skye Jethani, What If Jesus Was Serious? And which is really just a look at the Sermon on the Mount and really kind of the challenge in trying to understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to live with God and just, really kind of just challenging ourselves and really just taking time to really, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the right word I was here, but really just to just like, if Jesus was serious, if we really take that notion, what does that mean? Especially when it comes to, again, the Sermon on the Mount in particular, especially when it comes into identity, one as a follower of Jesus, but as a kingdom of God, as a citizen.
Yeah.
What are some things that would look like? So we're actually just, kind of this video really focuses on chapter 34 and 35 in the book, but really specifically it focuses on Matthew 6, 12 to 13, and which is part of the Our Father. It just says this, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Mm-hmm. So I think in this particular case, it's really important for us to understand evil a little bit and to be able to recognize
All right,
evil.
do tell.
Okay, well, I think Jesus is asking us first of all to forgive. So she's asking us to ask God for forgiveness for ourselves. So forgiveness from what? If we've looked at we've looked at the Lord's Prayer so far, we know that God is both our heavenly Father and a holy bonfire. And if we don't see this true version of God, we might not surrender ourselves to His will, because it's like He's not worth it, or He's not big enough or powerful enough. And then if we live an unsurrendered life to God, we could easily fall into the fear of not enough. I've got to provide for my own daily bread at any cost. And there's at the any cost we get into problem, right? Because then we're going to start stepping on people on the ladder on the way up, or we're going to trample on people's toes, and it could lead to all sorts of compromises where it could really hurt a lot of people along the way. And I think there's what Jesus may be hinting at is that he knows we're not perfect.
Well, and then all that stuff that moves us into rationalization, justification. Yeah. Well, there's a good reason that I did it this way. And I was also just thinking, like, right a little before that, also we were talking about your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. And maybe there's even that point of say, hey, you know what? I don't know that I can say I was always doing your will be done. Sometimes maybe I've let my own will, and going back to where it's been. It's damaged others, even myself, and to sit there and say, I need some forgiveness where I've gotten off that path.
And it may not, and as living as citizens of the kingdom thing makes me think too, that it's not necessarily just the things we did or have done. It's maybe some of the things we didn't do that we should have done. So I think Jesus understands our human nature, and we know that he knows we can never completely live up to those teachings all the time. So he instructs us to seek for forgiveness. And to me, it's kind of like the reset that kind of gets us back on track. And it doesn't stop there, though. He says that we need to forgive those who have wronged us. And there's even the intimation there that a little bit later in the chapter that if we don't forgive others, then God won't forgive us.
Right.
And I think, let's get to it, because I think this Skye brings out a very interesting point along the way here. But this reminds me of a parable that Jesus told. It's a little bit later in the chapter in Matthew. And it talks about, this is a great, I've heard this parable many times, and I didn't think through the amounts. So I was on the Wikipedia page for this particular thing, and it actually tried to explain what talents and denarii were. So let's get into that. So there's the stories about a man who worked in the king's court, and he owed the king 10,000 talents. Okay. So how much is that? Well, in Jesus' time, a talent was what was called, or was roughly 6,000 times a denarii, and a denarii was a day's wage.
Okay.
So just to put that in money for today. So I took a 7.5 hour day at a minimum wage of $15. So if you multiply that out, this guy owed the king $6.8 billion.
That's it?
That's a lot. I mean, apparently the annual taxes at the time of Jesus that was paid to Rome from all of Israel, that's Judah and Samaria, was only 600 talents every year. This guy owed the king 10,000 talents.
Wow.
So that's a lot. So the man begs obviously the man can't pay it back. So he begs the king for more time. What does the king do? Well, he forgives the guy's debt, like completely, just wipes it out. Yeah. You don't have to pay it back. Then that same man who borrowed the $6.8 billion and doesn't have to pay it back, what does he do? He goes and finds someone in the king's court, a fellow servant, and this guy owes him, let's see, what does he owe him? 100 denarii. So in relation, if we use the same math, that's worth about $10,000. So not nothing. But
significant, but
not anywhere near $6.8 billion.
Not even the same ballpark.
Not even the same ballpark. So you would think after being forgiven $6.8 billion, what would this guy do? Forgive his fellow servant? Well, no. He actually has the guy dragged off to debtor's prison, because that's what they did back then, and they sold off his family as slaves until the debt was paid. And obviously the king finds out about it, and he calls him a wicked servant. He said, I forgave you like so much, and yet you weren't even able to forgive your fellow court member there the small amount that he owed you. And so then he sent him to prison and made him pay or suffer the consequences of his debt. So I think it's important from this story and from what Jesus is saying in the Lord's Prayers that we need to seek forgiveness ourselves, and we need to offer forgiveness at the same time.
Well, I think it really is about, again, moving into this idea of a cultural identity, or a kingdom identity of forgiveness, and really the idea of we appreciate the forgiveness that we received and how it's positively affected us.
Yes.
And hope that it has. And therefore, we do want to extend that to others in the hopes that it will positively affect them and this, so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I like what Skye said. So we talked about the part where Jesus won't forgive us. That sounds kind of harsh, but I think Skye's got a really good explanation for that here. He says that if we, the reason we need to forgive and be forgiven ourselves is because receiving forgiveness is not enough. A healthy soul must also give it. Holding on to our anger and resentment, clinging to an identity as a victim, and refusing to release others from their debts will leave us incapable of receiving God's love or anyone else's. I thought, so it really becomes the posture of our heart internally that prevents us from receiving forgiveness when we don't offer it to other people, and not that God isn't willing to forgive us.
That's right.
So I think in recognizing evil, it's very easy to see it in other people. It's less obvious to see it in ourselves.
Yeah, that's true, and I think that is sometimes. Well, you get the different. What they talk what's this Jesus talks about the speck in your brother's eye, and you're missing the plank in your own eye is so much about that very idea. And it's not about your sin is always worse than someone else's or whatever issue that it is. It's just the idea that we're sometimes not so great at seeing the thing that is very blocking our ability to sometimes to see and to love and to all that we need to be dealt with. And
I think we obviously see it in culture, in politics, but even with Christians, we really draw a line between us and them. We're good. We don't need forgiveness. They're evil. They need forgiveness. Where I like the quote in the book that's from the former president of the Czech Republic that says, "The line between good and evil does not run clearly between them and us, but runs through each person." Yeah. And that's where we need to start looking inside. Okay, so we've kind of focused on evil. We realize there is evil in the world. there's evil in us. We need to be forgiven. We need to offer forgiveness. But then Jesus goes into this part about delivering us from evil. So Jesus instructs us to pray, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Well, and I do like this idea, and the idea, that the longer we live and follow with Jesus, and experience that goodness, we should. I think that's really the natural byproduct.
Yeah.
Desire to also be delivered from evil, but also to not walk down those roads at all.
Exactly. So I was looking up in a commentary by Michael J. Wilkins, the NIV application commentary on Matthew, this particular portion. And he talks about the motivations for us doing good, like instead of evil. So one is love, which is in response to God's love. So God loved us, so then we in turn can be loving. And once we've experienced real love from God, will move us mightily to love him and to love others. And then we might be motivated to actually emulate Jesus. And as a disciple, we'll become more like our master, who is Jesus. So from that, it leads into that same idea that our life will actually be transformed, and the evil will no longer have the appeal maybe it once did.
Yeah, and I think it's also deliverance from evil is to not allow ourselves to be desensitized to it.
Yeah.
To really want to speak into the injustices that we're seeing, and not just sort of like move away from it, or like, oh, that doesn't really necessarily affect me directly.
Yeah.
All of those things. It's no, we want to see that it becomes a part of, again, a DNA, a cultural identity of a follower of Jesus. And it's like, no, that's injustice. And we need to speak into that, because as much as, I don't want to personally, individually, because I guess we come back to the idea that this is a prayer prayed in community, as a community. It's not just my own, keep me, Jason, from evil. I do that. But how do we as a community and want to see that happen and be able to speak into the injustices, the evils that are affecting, again, not maybe even directly affecting me.
And I think along that line, that's where we tend to get hung up. What affects me? We want to, sometimes as followers of Jesus, we get hung up on trying to eliminate sin from our own lives. And I don't think being a follower of Jesus is about sin management.
No, it's not.
God doesn't, and I think the idea that Skye brought out in the book was God doesn't just deliver us from evil, he delivers us to something in response to that, which in this case is delivering us into God's presence.
And that is, I think, really an important thing that we see, I think, through the entirety of sort of, we'll say, the narrative of, especially the Gospels, it's a drawing into of himself. It's not just like, oh, stop doing evil. It's come into this presence where love and compassion and all that reside in as we experience it, as we feel it, as we share it with one another. It does its part of taking us away from places of evil, or whatever you want to, whatever that might look like.
Yeah. And I think my reaction to that sometimes is to create rules for myself. Don't do this, because this might lead me to that. And then it can just get bizarre if we try and impose those rules on other people, because they may not have the same issues we have.
Absolutely.
And two, it ends up not really being helpful long term, because when I can become proud if I actually do manage to follow my own rules, but more often than not, I end up breaking all the rules. And I think that gets us to the point where we understand that we're asking God to lead us not into temptation. So he's leading us somewhere, but he's the one who's leading us. We're not leading ourselves, because we are literally incapable of following all the rules all the time. And that isn't really the point.
Yeah.
And the point is that we're not trying to, so often Christians, I think, portray the Bible as a list of rules. And if we follow the rules, we get to go to heaven. And I know that's what lots of people who aren't followers of Jesus think about the Bible is. But really, it's about the relationship with God.
It is.
And that's really what God's story is. That's the story of the Bible. And I think so often we overlook that story. It's it's God's story about God and humans.
Yeah, and I think it's because we can be, understandably, I know I fall into this trap and have many times. We get so caught up on some of the details that we miss the greater story that is happening through all that and being woven in there. And I really do think there's this idea, like coming back to the idea that we can't sort of maybe do it ourselves, get out of that evil. I think there's a part of it is that sometimes the evil it is not so easily identified. And I think that's the thing that we're acknowledging in that moment, is that we're asking him, this thing that maybe I'm not seeing, maybe because I'm, caught up in a system that is just more, I'm a little more blind to it. Which too often we're sometimes blind to those things. And some of that is saying, hey, I'm asking you to open my eyes to maybe there's something there that, man, oh, wow, I didn't notice that. And our eyes need to be enlightened. And
maybe it's not the things we obviously sometimes notice. Like we can say murder's bad, robbing a bank is bad, but having a bad attitude or ignoring somebody or not doing something we know we should do, those are sometimes the evil that we overlook or don't see. Sometimes we're just snippy, right? And sometimes we need people to tell us, hey, is everything okay? Because you're not acting like yourself today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think that goes back to the first part we talked about, is being able to recognize that evil in ourselves. And that, and that maybe that's part of the leading that Jesus is talking about here, is just being able to lead us into the place where we recognize the evil and choose not to do it.
That's right.
Okay, well, I think that brings us pretty close to the end of this particular podcast, and we're glad that you joined us, and hopefully you found this talk helpful about the Sermon on the Mount and this part of the Lord's Prayer. And our prayer for you is that you will gain a better understanding of what Jesus is talking about here. And not only that, but really embrace the identity as a follower of Jesus and a citizen of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus was talking about. Because I think that's really more what this is all about for us, and really embracing those teachings of Jesus, not as a list of rules, but as having a relationship with God and being a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. So if you look in the show notes today, there'll be some questions there that you can look at that maybe can help you process some of this a little more. And if you're part of our church community here, please take a few minutes with your missional community in the next week or so and have a look at those questions and talk about it. And we hope that that is helpful for you to process that. If you don't have a copy of the book and we'd like one, we do have some copies left, I think. So if you want to leave a note in the show notes, we'll try and get contact with you and be able to get you a copy of the book so you can follow along with us. And we'll be back next week with some more podcasts on the Sermon on the Mount based on Skye Jethani's book, What If Jesus Was Serious?